Welcome to the TEFL Training Institute podcast, the bite-sized TEFL podcast for teachers, trainers, and managers. Hi everyone!
Welcome to the podcast. This, as you probably noticed, is our third anniversary episode. So to celebrate, we're doing a special long podcast, the longest one we've ever done. And we've got 6 special guests for you, and all of them are going to answer the same question. And that question is, what have you changed your mind about?
So first, we've got Dave Weller and Simon Galloway. So Dave currently works as an online diploma in TESOL tutor and blogs at barefootteflteacher.com. And Simon runs his distance learning courses for teachers and managers, and both of them have been on our podcast multiple times before.
Second up is Paul Nation, Emeritus Professor in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Paul's one of the most influential writers and researchers in vocabulary acquisition in the world, and you'll have heard him before in our second anniversary episode about reading last year.
And the third is Mike Courtois, who currently works as an academic director in a young learner language school, and Karin, who works as an academic manager at Trinity College London in China. You might remember Karin from our previous episode about applying learning, and Matt from episodes about observations, minimalism, and also teaching writing.
In the fourth segment, we'll hear from Carol Lethaby, who's a teacher trainer, and materials writer based in the US and Mexico. And you might remember Carol from our episode about neuroscience. And you can learn more from her on her website, www.clethaby.com.
And finally, Ross and myself will talk about what we have changed our minds about over the years.
Great. Enjoy the podcast. The longest one ever. So, Dave Weller, Simon Galloway, you've both been involved in English education for what, 12, 15 years?
It's 15 years for me.
Wow.
Yeah,
Same.
Pretty much.
What have you changed your mind about? There must be one thing, Dave.
Since the beginning, you're talking about since the beginning of my teaching.
It could be at any point at all.
The biggest thing that I've changed my mind about since I began, both for myself and for students and trainees and everything, is I used to think in quite a fixed mindset. I used to think, well, some teachers are good, some teachers aren't, and some students are smart and some students are not. And then I think the more I do this, the more I realise it's really about, it's like attitude and effort are going to be the things that make the difference. But it's a bit of a cliche, because I know everyone kind of starts to think that way these days, I think. Is it a bit of a...
I don't know. I think that's still true to an extent, isn't it? I'm not sure. I still think, I ultimately do think in those terms that for trainees, for example, that you find some, at the beginning of the course, and you probably think, these guys are the stars, and you've got the A people, the B people, and the C people. I almost think that fixed mindset, growth mindset is one of those things that I know as a fact, but I'm not sure the extent to which I genuinely apply it or really believe in it deep down. I mean, have you seen courses where people who were genuinely, like, you thought they were the weakest people at the beginning ended up becoming the strongest at the end?
I don't think the courses are long enough for that, but I think there are definitely teachers that start about that level and end about that level because they're not really trying to grow, and then there are other people that actually you see effort, and I can see that through my distance learning courses too. There are some people that start with pretty bad first assignment, and by the end they're way up here. There are other people who just...
I can't think of people on diplomas that we ran that we, for example, observed them at the beginning before they got on the course. And some people that we thought they're not good enough to get on the course. There was a big kerfuffle. Eventually they got on the course and they did really well. And then I've also seen the opposite of people that we said, you'll have no problems on this course, and the people go on to fail.
Yeah, and I wonder if actually what we're saying to them is even affecting that. If we tell them you're going to do great, then that actually fosters a fixed mindset in them.
Well, it goes back to that, what we were saying earlier about praising the effort. If you tell someone, you'll have no problem in this course, it's kind of always setting them up to fail. Maybe they won't put the effort in as much because they think they're intrinsic or naturally intelligent enough, or they're already at that skill level, they won't need to put in as much effort, and they struggle.
Yeah,
it certainly happens with some people.
it's almost like there's an unspoken assumption, isn't there, that these people are going to put in X amount of effort, and that's the bit that doesn't get said. You'll be fine. You're going to do really well in this course.
Assuming that you spend 10 hours a week, and then
And a lot of people don't. Yeah, absolutely. Dave?
All right. I think...
Let me guess. You didn't used to believe in learning styles, but now you do.
No, actually. I think that when I was a new teacher, perhaps 1 year or 2 years in, I was always so certain of everything. I think on my original course, that I took everything as gospel, and I held my opinion so strongly, and I was so sure about everything. I knew I had a lot to learn, but what I did already know, I was certain that this is just the way things are. But since then, I've changed my mind and been exposed to new ideas, new evidence, and I've changed everything so many times over the years that I think, I can't remember who said it, something like, strong ideas held lightly, something like that. And the longer I'm in this industry, the more I fully agree with that. So I fully believe in what I do and how I do it. But if you show me some evidence or a compelling study or show me a different way of doing things, I'll willingly change and try something new. I think that willingness to change, I guess that's related to what you said in the way, Simon, a willingness to change and be shown to be wrong, I actually welcome now.
That almost sounds like a perfect description of the Dunning-Kruger effect, that after your cert course that you believed 100% in everything like it was the gospel, and the more you learn that, the less confident you become in those things. Hey, do you think there's a problem then in how we present information to trainees on cert courses? Because I think I always found that maybe it's at like diploma level that we maybe encourage people to sort of think critically about the things that are being shown to them, but the emphasis on introductory courses is here's what you need to just be okay in the classroom and survive your first year. But maybe we're giving people false confidence in, and maybe actually the more effective learner autonomy long-term strategy to teach people is, I'm going to show you these things, these principles, but you also need to be able to question them.
Well, it goes back to something I've said before. It's you could take it to the wider education industry as a whole. Like in the language classroom, should we even be teaching language? Should we just be teaching skills and applying motivation? Because if you give someone the motivation to learn and the skills to be able to do so independently, then they're inevitably going to be able to learn a language. It's the same with any course, almost. I think the days of a tutor being a gatekeeper to information are long gone. With the advent of the internet, sure, a curated course is much easier to work through step by step because you can trust the authority of the source, and it's broken down and spoon-fed to you in a certain way. But yeah, I do think that in most courses that we run, there's a lack of teaching meta skills at the beginning, or teaching to think critically. I think every course assumes that a course before has done that, even going back to initial education from 5 to 18. It's something I think missing in that. I think that's a much larger issue.
Yeah, we assume that everyone's got a degree or whatever, so they must know this, right? And then their university course thought, they must have learned this at school. Their secondary school thought they must have learned this at primary school.
And then they thought, parents must
have taught them that. Yeah.
But I might make a flip side argument. It's, we're saying this from a position of 10, 15 years in the industry.
Yeah.
And as a new teacher, I can still vividly remember going, just tell me what to do next. I just want to get through my next lesson. I want to survive. And I think it is a responsibility for initial teacher training courses to be able to provide that to teachers so they can go into the class with the confidence that the learners will probably learn something. If you just give them a bunch of meta skills to work with, and then throw them into a highly pressured environment, they're going to fall to pieces. They need to have something to fall back on.
So maybe there's an advantage of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and if you know almost nothing and you're really confident in it, that will overcome your lack of skill. If you're a new teacher and you said, I'm telling you all these things, but maybe they're true, maybe they're not, you maybe go into the classroom and you wouldn't have the confidence to make up for your lack of skill. So maybe that Dunning-Kruger effect, maybe there is actually some benefit to having that and really believing in something even when you don't know much about it as a new teacher.
I think you can keep it like it is to some extent, but just keep on every time, just keep on reminding the trainees that they can make their own
this is the best way to do something, or is it?
But just keep on pushing for deeper questions like, okay, so was that effective in your lesson today? How do you know that? What real evidence were you going on? What did the student? I saw this student do this. Why do you think that was? Do you think this same thing would work in another class?
What's the point of life? Why are you here? Is everything even worth it?
It's interesting. There must be a point when it would become counterproductive, and you just end up with people leaving and
there's
going.
So doubt. They're in so much doubt, right?
Yeah.
They just don't know. Yeah.
But no, it's true. I think, again, it's as a good trainer or a good manager, you should be able to spot when your teachers are ready, they're not being challenged. And I think when I was at a DOS, you could see teachers that were ready to be pushed to the next level. People reach plateaus, and you could see when somebody goes, well, I know everything now. And actually, you don't. Let me introduce you to some new ideas, like differentiation in the classroom or some of the higher level teaching skills. And they go, oh, wow, I had no idea you could do this. When their ability to implement what they know reaches what they know, then you should almost increase. Or that's the time when to give them more knowledge so they can then turn that knowledge into skill.
I like this idea of that plateau. Yeah, like if someone's already on like a slope, you don't want to like be sticking them on a much steeper slope.
Give them a heavier
just for the sake of
push-up.
it. Yeah, just going to pick a Sisyphean boulder or something. But yeah, if they're on a plateau already, you've got to get them on a slope.
So if you had a trainee at the beginning of the course who was really struggling to give instructions, and you're like, okay, here's a 3-step way of doing it. Tell them in simple language, model it, and then ask questions.
Show them, tell them, ask them, give them, Ross.
Right. But then you wouldn't want to do it afterwards. Well, when would that not be effective? Do you know what I mean? Because you're just trying to get that person to that basic level.
When you're observing them, you wouldn't want to sidle up to them and go, so you know that according to Vygotsky, the social construction theory, what you shouldn't really have done that there. This kid's ZPD is way off.
That might be too much. Hi, Paul. Welcome back. You published your first paper on language teaching, I think, in about 1970. So you've had a very long career as well as a fascinating one. Can you tell us what's one thing that you've changed your mind about during your time from being a teacher all the way up to the present?
First of all, I like to think I always got it right from the beginning. but I guess the main change that has occurred to me is the idea of the roles of the teacher and how the role of the teacher as a teacher becomes an important role, but not the major role of the teacher. I see the roles of the teacher as, I always forget, I say there's 4 or 5 roles of the teacher and I always forget one of them. The number 1 role is the planner. The number 2 role is the organizer of activities and opportunities to learn. The 3rd role is something like the trainer who trains the learners in strategies to learn vocabulary and strategies to deal with their language learning. The 4th role would be the teacher as a tester who's giving learners feedback about their progress and showing them how much vocab they know and so on. And the 5th role is the teacher as a teacher who actually gets up in front of the class or guides them through an intensive reading passage or something like that, And I think that those roles are sort of ranked in the order of sort of planner, organizer, trainer, tester, and teacher. And so that probably would be the major change I've sort of come to during my reading of research and doing research and so on. On the other hand, I also have to say that just about every PhD student I've had, and I've had a lot, have proved me wrong about the topic that they were working with. And that's virtually without exception. Sometimes proved me spectacularly wrong, I remember, for example, Teresa Chung doing research on technical vocabulary. I'd said in the first edition of Learning Vocabulary in Another Language that technical vocabulary probably made up about 5% of the running words in text. When she did her research, she found it made between 20 and 30% of the running words in the text, which is quite a big difference. 1 word out of 3 compared to 1 word out of 20, And so that was sort of major changes. Once people have done the research, you say, wow, I think I've got to step back and change my ideas about that. But I would say that the biggest one is the idea of, you need a balanced approach to vocabulary learning, and you need to see that teaching is a part of that, but only a part of it, and you've got to make sure that the others are there. Because I would have given a much greater role to teaching very early on in my career.
Matt, what's something that you have changed your mind about? And why did you change your mind?
What haven't I changed my mind about? Like, looking back to my first year in Korea compared to now, I don't think there's a single belief that I still have that I had then.
Well,
The biggest, underlying thing that has changed in me was at first when I was a teacher, I kind of thought the more knowledge I had about the language I could acquire, the better teacher I would become. And I actually don't think that's really necessary. Being able to discuss any grammar point at the drop of a hat to me is not what makes a good teacher anymore. Having some of the skills to draw that from people and to run a good activity and to facilitate improvement is much more essential to being a teacher than just knowing the subject matter.
can you remember when you changed your mind about that? Or was that a long process? Or what happened?
I think it was a really long process. I taught in Korea and Russia and probably my first year within China. I think I looked at teaching language in this way. Within my first year of teaching at my last company, there was a job opening for content developer, content writer, something like that. And I remember I took one of my favorite grammar skills lessons, and I think it was about the passive voice, and I submitted it to the manager of this department, and he sent me back an email that was like 3 pages full of criticisms.
Wow.
I think the most positive things he said were basically about some of the animations that I had in my PPT. and not about the content of this deep analysis of the passive voice. Like, he was just saying, like, the method in which you're doing it, it's not about the grammar itself, it's how you present it and stuff like this. And I think I improved so much. When that manager sent me such critical feedback, and I kind of started approaching teaching grammar from sort of what context am I going to use, and rather than having this giant scope of understanding the passive voice, every tense in English, and rather than looking at myself as somebody who analyzes language, that's not my job, right? And so many English teachers talk about how being prescriptive is so bad, but they're teachers. That's what they're doing. They're not writing dictionaries. They're not contributing to a corpus, right? We are not describing the language here. We are taking what those guys have and then presenting it to students in a way that they can practice it. And so I think once I got over that mindset that I'm holding the key to the language and I'm the person who's defining the language, like, I got over that and said, no, I'm coming up with situations and facilitating situations in which they can use it. I think I improved a lot as a teacher and a trainer.
Teachers used to just think, well, my English is good, so I can teach English. Or I'm not confident in teaching English because I'm not confident in my English. Language awareness, like your knowledge in phonology, in lexis, in grammar, they are important and they are very helpful. It's just like the teaching skills, they are very important and they should be emphasized more.
You need both, don't you?
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you don't know any English and you're the best teacher in the world, you can't teach English. And equally, if you're amazing at English and you can't teach at all, that's not going to work either. You need a bit of both. But I think at some point, especially for lower levels, right, that the knowledge of English becomes less important than the skill to put it across.
I always thought I was, because I was trained in a certiso, diptiso way, so I always believed that I need to build the classes around the learners and I need to train teachers in a reflective, coaching way. And I believed that was more effective than any other ways. Recently, I just come to realize that not necessarily. And you said it's good challenge or good chance for me to try out different things or give people different options and see how things go. It's not one way better than the others. It's just there are different ways of doing things.
Yeah, this is one of the dangers, I think, of just working in one environment for a very long time. Is you're often only exposed to one way of doing things, and you get transposed to another place, and you automatically just assume, well, this isn't the right way to do things. This is wrong. This isn't most effective. But is that true? Is there any evidence?
Yeah, exactly. So I think all the things that I've tried out now kind of shaped how I do training and classes now, and they're definitely not the same as when I was in the old environment for such a long time.
Hi, Carol. I think you're very well known for integrating ideas from research into your practice. So we'd really love to hear from you about what's one of the most important or the most interesting things that you've changed your mind about over the years.
Yeah, I think the example that came to mind here certainly was not using the mother tongue in the classroom. I did my PGCE in the UK in learning to teach French and German. This was mid-80s, and the communicative approach in foreign language teaching then had a big hold on the profession, and we were explicitly taught not to use English at all when we were teaching French or teaching German. And so, of course, I carried this on when I started teaching English, and then I did my Delta, and the same thing, it came up all along the way. And I remember it seemed to go against my intuitions, but as I know now, don't always rely on your intuitions because they might not be right. But I actually did some research into this as part of my master's degree here in Mexico, and found out that when you ask learners, one of the things I asked them in a piece of research I did was, do you want your teacher to have English as their first language? Do you want your teacher to be a native speaker of English? Anyway, a list of categories, and the one that came out top at all levels, especially at beginner level, was they don't care if their teacher is a native speaker, but they want a teacher who can speak their first language, who knows their first language. And it made me think about, well, why then are we telling people you don't need to speak the learner's first language? Or you don't need to know the learner's first language, and you don't use the learner's first language, it's better not to. And, I was reading the history of English language teaching, obviously Philipson's linguistic imperialism. You realise how this happened and how this idea was transmitted and perpetuated. And now, of course, knowing more about the brain and how we learn, I really don't believe that. I'm convinced that we need to use the learner's first language in order to teach them another language.
And how would that look like in the classroom then, Carol? Do you have any examples of, what that might look like with a group of students?
Yeah. I remember actually trying to teach the difference between first and second conditionals when I was teaching at the Anglo-Mexican Institute in Guadalajara here. And there was this explanation that I was trying to work with them with levels of probability, and it depended if you were an optimist or a pessimist, whether you would use the first conditional or the second conditional, and how confusing that was and how unsatisfactory it was for a learner, I'm sure, when now I would think I would just tell those learners, this is how you say it, the first conditional corresponds to this in Spanish, the second conditional corresponds to this in Spanish. Spending ages trying to define a word or an expression when, just a quick translation could really help in that case. Using the learner's language for kind of effective reasons. I remember, I didn't speak a word of Spanish when I first arrived here, and I was given beginners classes. Precisely because it was the idea that this would be a genuine communication situation, etc. But I couldn't get to know my students. It means I couldn't ask them, how are things, going, how are you getting on in these certain situations, or what things are worrying you about learning English. Don't worry about this. Look, it just means this. I can help you with this later. Or all these kinds of things that really enhance language learning, I wasn't able to do because the idea was that, we couldn't speak each other's language. And I think in monolingual situations, it's just ridiculous not to take into account and use the learner's mother tongue.
So we heard there from a bunch of our favourite guests over the last couple of years about things that they have changed their minds about. Tracy, to finish the podcast, what have you changed your mind about?
So I think there are a lot of things, I've changed over the last few years. But one thing is how I can connect uneducation related either theories or practice and into what I'm doing, my working context. So in the past, I remember when I started being a trainer, And then I, read a lot of books about teaching and training and theories and ESL, TESOL, exactly relates to this industry. And then I realized, and maybe, I've just focused too specific to this industry, to this area. And then when I, listen to podcasts and watch TV or read other books or magazines or journals, and sometimes I realize that actually something that relates to this industry could really help what I'm doing. I need to give you an example, right?
Yeah, sure. Give us an example, yeah.
So I read a book about how marriage work, right? And then the book is the 7 principles for making marriage work. I think when I started reading this book, I didn't expect any connection to work. But the more I read about it, and I realized actually there were a lot of principles can apply to work, to manage a team. For example, there's one thing mentioned about criticism versus complaint. You can see the difference between these two, right? And you can say...
Well, what's the difference? Do you want to give us an example of each?
Okay, so like a complaint, and you can say, you didn't do this very well, or you didn't complete it on time, right? For example, at work. But if criticism is like, you always did this way, you're not able to do this, or something like that, and try to.
It sounds like more you're talking about the person rather than the actions that they've taken or not taken.
Yeah, so I think of course, and people can complain, right? And you can give constructive feedback to the other person. You can talk about the facts, you can talk about the behavior, but you don't want to jump in a conclusion and say, this person is not able to, or this is always like this. You're not giving the person another chance to reflect and to make things better. So I think when you're working with colleagues or you are managing a team, it's really important to distinguish the difference between a complaint and a criticism. And another thing I think is super, super useful when I had a difficult conversation or try to give feedback to a staff, just try not to have a hard startup when you're having a conversation. So even though before you start the conversation, you knew it's probably towards some kind of conflict or uncomfortable situation, but still try to avoid a harsh startup in a conversation. Maybe you want to ask this person and how they feel and what's going on and what happened, and find out more information, and then provide more specific information to the person, and then give the feedback, and then action plan, rather than at the beginning and said something very negative. So it's difficult for the person to receive your feedback. So for you, Ross, and you work in different roles, and for the last 12, 13 years, you're a civil engineer, and then you work in education. So anything that you've changed over the last few years?
I think something I'm in the process of changing my mind about is that a lot of the things that we talk about here and we do on teacher training courses and in materials design and management is we concentrate so much on what goes on in the classroom, as that's where the learning and everything takes place, and that's fundamentally the most important thing. I think I used to believe that, but I'm coming to maybe believe more that what happens in the classroom might not be the most important part of their learning process, and what might actually be more important is what happens before the class and what happens after the class. I found a nice quote yesterday from someone called Ausubel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who says, "If I were to black out and reduce all of education psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach him accordingly." That was a really cool quote. How much time do we ever spend actually finding out what students already know? I would guess generally not very much time, or not a lot of time, and certainly on this podcast we don't talk about that very much. And I think the same thing for what happens after class. I think we tend to assume that things finish once the students walk out the door, but we know from memory curves and things that if students don't revise what they've already learned, then they forget the vast majority of things that happen in classroom. And I think that that's something I've changed my mind about, and I think we need to spend more time focusing on what happens outside the classroom every bit as much, if not more, compared to what happens inside the classroom.
So how can you do that then? Like to find out more information before the class about the students?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't have all the answers to it, but I just think it's more important that we actually think, like ascertaining what students already know before a lesson. So finding out like what problems do they have and designing our lessons to try and solve specific issues that students have. Whereas I think normally what happens is students get placed in a certain level and then they just work through a course book which kind of roughly approximates what they know and what they don't know. But we don't really go into enough effort to find out like what are the sort of the holes and the gaps or the peaks and the troughs in students' current ability and knowledge, and try and smooth over the troughs and make sure that what we're doing in class fills those in.
Have you ever seen any examples or some teachers who were able to focus on what happened before the class or after the class?
Well, I think some things like the whole flipped classroom principle, I think kind of goes towards that. And I think some educational technology works towards aiming to find out what students know before the class and has them answering questions and makes sure that they reach a level of mastery before they move on to the next topic. But I don't think that's the norm in most scenarios. And I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. And I think those things are, like I say, every bit as important probably as what goes on in the classroom and deserve our attention a lot. Okay, well, everyone, I hope that was interesting. I hope that, or I presume for a lot of people, that the reason that you're listening to this podcast in the first place is so that we can change your minds about some issues that are important. And hopefully it was useful hearing how some of our favourite guests have changed their minds about different things over the years.
Yeah, all right. Thanks very much for listening.
Over the last 3 years. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. For more podcasts, videos, and blogs, visit our website www.TEFLtraininginstitute.com.
If you've got a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss, leave us a comment.
And if you want to keep up to date with our latest content, add us on WeChat at TEFL Training Institute.
And if you enjoyed our podcast, please rate us on iTunes.